And 2016, one action sequel provides that one man, one job premise calls still feel theaters work with, even against superhero blockbusters and franchise giants. Mechanics. Recession. Come em Brasil as Assassino a Preço Físico 2, A Ressurreição. Broke James Stand back as Arthur Bishop, a Hitman, voltagem a de finale desperate. Instead is dragent back into a world of impossible contract, exact location, and enemies all go exactly how to hurt win. The film is pretty critics and audience almost perfectly down the middle. Some college is doomed from each George's production valued. Others college each a shallow copy of best action movies, but online the debate never really stopped. Clips of Paul City assassins and prison break sequence is spread across social media, tuning these models sequel in a genuine talkable punch. Today is break down is this film worked for so many people and is frustrated so many ouch.
Mechanic Resurrection came out in 2016 as a direct sequel to the 2011 remake simply titled The Mechanic, which itself was a modernized version of a 1972 film that starred Charles Bronson. That history matters because it tells you something about how this franchise was built. It was never designed as an original idea, chasing a bold new vision. It was built on the bones of an older story, reshaped twice over for decades to fit whichever action style the era demanded. In the 70s it was Bronson, cold and weathered, playing a killer who lived by a code. In 2011 it became Jason Statham, sharper, faster, more stylish, fitting the post-transporter, post-crank version of action cinema that audiences had grown used to. By 2016, the sequel had to answer a simple question: what do you do with a hitman who already got his happy ending? The first Statham film ended with Bishop seemingly dead, then alive, driving off into uncertainty. Resurrection had to explain how he survived, where he disappeared to, and why he would ever pick up a weapon again. The answer the film lands on is almost painfully simple. He hides. He runs. He tries to become nobody. And of course nobody in an action franchise ever gets to stay nobody for long. The film opens with Bishop living under a new identity in Rio de Janeiro, teaching sailing lessons, blending into a life of sunshine and anonymity. This choice of setting is worth pausing on, because so much of this movie's identity comes from where it takes place rather than what happens in the plot. Rio gives the opening act a completely different visual texture than a typical American action thriller. Instead of gray cities and rain-slick streets, audiences get beaches, boats, favelas glimpsed from a distance, and warm golden light. It signals early that this film is going to lean heavily into travelogue aesthetics, treating each location less like a backdrop and more like a selling point. That is not necessarily a criticism. Plenty of hit action films from the Bond series to the Fast and Furious franchise use exotic locations as part of the spectacle itself. Mechanic! Resurrection simply leans into it more explicitly than most, almost advertising itself as a world tour with occasional gunfire. Bishop's piece does not last, and the person sent to break it is Raya Crane, played by Sam Hazeldine. Crane is revealed to be connected to a man Bishop killed in the first film, which gives the sequel a built-in motive without needing much extra exposition. Crane wants revenge, but he is smart enough to know that killing Bishop outright would be too quick and, from a script standpoint, would end the movie in 5 minutes. Instead, he kidnaps Gina, played by Jessica Alba, the woman Bishop has fallen for during his time in hiding. This is the engine that drives the entire plot. Bishop is told that if he wants Gina to live, he has to complete 3 assassinations, each one disguised to look like an accident. It's a premise that borrows heavily from heist movie structure. Instead of planning one big robbery, the film is broken into 3 connected missions, each with its own location, its own obstacles, and its own version of Bishop improvising his way through impossible odds. The first assassination target is a warlord being held in a maximum security prison in Thailand. Bishop's task sounds almost like a puzzle rather than a hit. He has to get the man killed inside a facility where he supposedly cannot be touched, without spoiling every technical detail. The sequence uses the prison's own vulnerabilities against it, with Bishop engineering a situation that looks like a natural accident rather than an assassination. What stands out here is the way the film treats problem-solving as spectacle. It is less concerned with tension in the traditional thriller sense, and more concerned with the satisfaction of watching an elaborate plan click into place, piece by piece. It's the same pleasure you get from watching someone build an elaborate domino chain and then knock the first piece over. You know what is coming, you just want to see it executed cleanly. The second target lives in a penthouse with an infinity pool in Sydney, Australia. And this is the sequence that ended up defined by its visuals more than anything else in the entire movie. The pool hangs off the edge of a skyscraper, and Bishop's plan to eliminate the target involves manipulating the pool's own structure against the man living above it. It became one of the most talked about scenes when the film was released. Not because of dialogue or character work, but purely because of how visually inventive and vertigo-inducing the setup looks. Clips of this scene circulated widely online, showing exactly the kind of moment that gets pulled out of context and shared across social media. Disconnected from plot, but effective purely as spectacle. This is worth noting critically, because it shows how a modern action movie can succeed in cultural conversation even when its overall narrative is thin. A single striking image, an infinity pool hundreds of feet in the air with a man's life hanging in the balance, can carry a film's reputation further than its script ever could. The third assassination target is an arms dealer, and this sequence takes Bishop onto a yacht. Tying back into the maritime imagery that opened the film in Rio, there's a thematic symmetry here that the filmmakers clearly intended. Even if it is not spelled out directly, Bishop began the story on the water, at peace, teaching people to sail. He ends his string of forced killings on the water again, this time using boats and open sea as a weapon rather than a sanctuary. Whether or not audiences consciously picked up on that parallel, it gives the film a small amount of structural elegance that elevates it slightly above a random collection of action set pieces. Throughout these 3 assassination sequences, the film keeps circling back to Gina's captivity. And this is where a lot of the criticism aimed at mechanic resurrection becomes most valid. Gina exists in the story almost entirely as something to be protected and something to motivate Bishop. She is given moments of agency here and there. Brief flashes where she resists her captors or shows more depth, than a typical hostage character. But the film never fully commits to making her a co-lead rather than a prize to be recovered. Jessica Alba does what she can with the material, bringing warmth to her early scenes with Bishop so that the audience actually feels something is at stake when she's taken. But the structural problem remains. An action movie built around rescuing a kidnapped love interest was already a familiar formula by 2016. And the film does not do much to subvert or refresh that formula. It executes it competently, but competently is a different thing from memorably. The villain situation follows a similar pattern of competent execution without much innovation. Raya Crane, played by Sam Hazeldine, functions adequately as the orchestrator of Bishop's suffering, but he never becomes a truly compelling screen presence in the way the best action movie villains do. Compare him to the calculating menace of a Bond villain or the physical intensity of an opponent in a film like The Raid, and Crane feels comparatively flat. He has a personal motive, has sources, he has a plan, but he lacks the specific, memorable quirks that make audiences quote a villain years after a film's release. This matters because action movies often live or die not on their heroes, who are frequently interchangeable across the genre, but on the strength of the person standing in the hero's way. A weak villain caps how high the tension in a film can climb, no matter how well the action itself is choreographed. Where the film does gain some unexpected energy is in its supporting cast, particularly Tommy Lee Jones, who plays a wealthy arms dealer and former associate of Bishop's named Max Adams. Jones brings a completely different energy to every scene he's in, dressed in loud floral shirts, sunglasses, and an air of complete disinterest in the danger surrounding him. Critics and audiences alike singled out his performance as one of the highlights of the film, and it's easy to understand why. In a movie otherwise populated by fairly serious, grim-faced characters, Jones plays his role like he wandered in from a completely different, much weirder film, and that contrast makes his scenes stand out. His limited screen time became a frequent point of discussion online, with viewers wishing he had more to do, which is often a sign that a supporting performance succeeded in leaving audiences wanting more rather than overstaying its welcome. Michelle Yeoh also appears in the film, playing a doctor connected to Bishop's past in Southeast Asia, though her role is comparatively small given her stature as an action and dramatic performer. This is another point where the film's ambition and its execution don't quite line up. Casting an actress with Yeoh's history in martial arts cinema, and then giving her a role that mostly exists to provide exposition and emotional grounding rather than action feels like a missed opportunity. It is not a wasted performance exactly, since Yeoh brings dignity and warmth to every scene regardless of how much material she's given. But from a purely strategic standpoint, the film could have used her specific skill set in ways it chose not to. Jason Statham himself remains the film's most reliable asset. By 2016, Statham had built a reputation across more than a decade of action cinema. From the Transporter series to Crank to his growing role within the Fast and Furious franchise, which he had joined the previous year. Audiences knew exactly what they were getting when his name appeared on a poster: physical, grounded action, minimal reliance on obvious visual effects for fight choreography, and a performance style built more on economy of movement and dry line delivery than on emotional range. Mechanic. Resurrection plays entirely to those strengths. Bishop is not written as a particularly deep character, and the film does not pretend otherwise. He is defined by competence, by his ability to solve seemingly impossible problems using engineering, patience, and physical skill. Statham sells that competence completely, moving through each set piece with the calm of someone who has already run the scenario in his head a dozen times before executing it. This brings up an important point about what kind of action movie mechanic Resurrection actually is, as opposed to what some viewers may have expected walking in. This is not a film built around chaotic, high-speed spectacle in the way a Fast and Furious entry is. It is not built around brutal, close-quarters hand-to-hand combat in the way the John Wick series, which had begun just 2 years earlier in 2014, was redefining the genre. Instead, Mechanic Resurrection sits closer to a heist thriller wearing an action movie's clothing. Its pleasures come from planning, engineering, and improvisation rather than from raw physical confrontation, even though physical confrontation certainly appears throughout. This distinction is worth making because a lot of the online discussion and criticism aimed at the film seems to measure it against the wrong yardstick. Judged purely as a fists and bullets action spectacle, it can feel comparatively restrained. Judged as a globe-trotting engineering puzzle with an action movie's budget, it delivers exactly what it promises. The direction was handled by Dennis Gansel, a filmmaker whose background includes German-language dramas before moving into English-language studio action work. This is an interesting pairing because Gansel's earlier films tended to focus more on tension, atmosphere, and character psychology than pure spectacle. Some of that sensibility shows up in Mechanic Resurrection, particularly in the way the film lingers on Bishop's careful planning process rather than rushing straight into explosions. There is a patience to how each assassination sequence unfolds, giving the audience time to understand the mechanics of the plan before it's executed. Whether or not that patience works for a given viewer depends heavily on personal taste. Some audiences found the deliberate pacing satisfying, allowing tension to build methodically. Others found the same pacing sluggish, wishing the film would move faster between its bursts of action. Visually, cinematographer Daniel Aronio gives the film a glossy, high-contrast look that suits its globe-trotting structure. Each location, Rio, Thailand, Sydney, and eventually Bulgaria standing in for other settings, receives its own distinct color palette and lighting approach, which helps differentiate the film's segments, even when the plot itself follows a fairly repetitive structure of target, obstacle, plan, execution. This kind of visual variety is one of the film's more consistently praised elements, even among critics who otherwise found it forgettable. It looks expensive, and in an era where audiences are increasingly sensitive to films that feel visually flat or overly reliant on digital backdrops. Having real, striking locations gave Mechanic Resurrection an edge that some competitors in the same budget range lacked. The action choreography itself deserves a more detailed breakdown, because this is ultimately what the film will be remembered for, if it's remembered at all. Statham has always favored practical stunt work over heavily digital action, and Mechanic Resurrection continues that tradition. The prison sequence in Thailand relies on environmental hazards and improvised weaponry rather than gunfights, forcing Bishop to think his way through obstacles using whatever is available to him. This kind of scene plays to a specific action movie tradition, the resourceful problem-solver archetype, which stretches back through decades of spy thrillers and heist films. The Sydney penthouse sequence, by contrast, relies almost entirely on the location itself as the source of danger, using height, water, and structural engineering as the actual antagonist forces rather than henchmen with guns. This is arguably the film's most creative sequence precisely because it finds tension in physics and architecture rather than simply throwing more bodies at the hero. The yacht sequence in the third act returns to a more conventional mixture of hand-to-hand combat and explosive set pieces, giving the film a suitably loud climax, even if it's less inventive than what came before it. One recurring criticism aimed at the film involves its handling of internal logic and plausibility. Bishop's ability to travel between continents, acquire specialized equipment, and execute complex engineering feats within extremely tight timeframes stretches believability well past its breaking point if you stop to think about it too carefully. Reviewers pointed out specific examples of this, such as questioning how certain rescues and extractions could logistically happen as quickly as the film implies. This is a common tension within globe-trotting action thrillers generally. Movies in this genre ask audiences to accept a kind of geographic and logistical shorthand where travel time, customs, equipment sourcing, and physical recovery from injury all bend to serve narrative momentum rather than realism. Some viewers are perfectly happy to accept this shorthand as part of the genre's unwritten rules, treating it the same way they'd accept a martial artist getting up seconds after being thrown through a wall. Other viewers find this kind of unrealistic compression actively distracting, pulling them out of the experience because the film asks them to ignore basic logistics that a slightly more grounded script could have addressed. Mechanic. Resurrection sits fairly deep on the don't think about it to hard end of that spectrum, and audience reaction to the film often correlates directly with how willing a given viewer is to simply go along with that kind of storytelling. The film's score, composed by Mark Isham, supports the action without drawing much attention to itself, which is a fairly common approach for mid-budget action thrillers of this era. It provides tension during planning sequences and heightens momentum during the physical set pieces. But it does not offer the kind of instantly recognizable musical identity that some action franchises use as a signature. The soundtrack also features contemporary music placed at key points, including blues-inflected rock during some of the more stylish character moments, which helps give certain scenes, particularly those involving Tommy Lee Jones's character, a distinct flavor separate from the more generic orchestral tension elsewhere in the film. Turning to the film's critical reception, Mechanic, Resurrection landed in a fairly predictable place for this kind of mid-budget action sequel. Critics were largely lukewarm, acknowledging the visual spectacle and the commitment of the cast, while criticizing the thinness of the plot and the predictability of the overall structure. Audience reception, however, skewed noticeably more positive than critical reception, which is a pattern seen frequently with pure entertainment-focused action films that don't aspire to prestige filmmaking. This gap between critical and audience scores tells its own story about what different segments of viewers actually want from a film like this. Critics, evaluating the movie against the broader landscape of cinema, tend to weigh originality, character development, and thematic depth heavily in their judgments. General audiences going to see an action sequel on a Friday night are often weighing a different set of criteria entirely. Is it fun? Does it deliver satisfying spectacle? Does the lead actor look convincing doing dangerous things? And does the film respect their time by moving at a reasonable pace? Judged by that second set of criteria, Mechanic, Resurrection performed considerably better, which explains why it found a broad audience internationally even as professional critics remained divided or lukewarm. Commercially, the film performed solidly relative to its budget, benefiting significantly from international box office, particularly across markets in Asia and Latin America where Statham's brand of action cinema has historically found strong support. This global commercial performance is worth discussing because it highlights an important shift in how mid-budget action films justify their existence in the modern film industry. A film doesn't necessarily need to dominate domestic box office charts or win over critics if it can consistently perform well overseas, where audiences may respond more directly to star power, action spectacle, and international settings than to nuanced storytelling. Mechanic, Resurrection fits neatly into that commercial model, using its cast, its stunt work, and its variety of glamorous locations as the primary selling points rather than leaning on award season ambitions. Comparing this sequel to its 2011 predecessor reveals some interesting shifts in tone and priority. The first Statham-led Mechanic film focused more tightly on the mentor-student relationship between Bishop and a younger character played by Ben Foster. giving that film a stronger emotional through line, even as it delivered similarly brutal, efficient action sequences. Resurrection largely abandons that mentorship dynamic in favor of a romance and rescue plot, which is a fairly common structural shift for sequels looking to expand a franchise's emotional stakes without repeating the exact formula of the first installment. Whether this shift represents an improvement depends heavily on what a given viewer valued most about the first film. Fans who appreciated the tighter character focus of the original may find the sequel's broader, more globe-trotting approach to be a step backward in terms of narrative intimacy. Fans who wanted bigger spectacle and higher stakes may see the sequel as a natural, satisfying escalation. It's also worth placing Mechanic Resurrection within the broader context of remake and sequel culture in mainstream cinema during the 2010s. This was an era when Hollywood studios were increasingly cautious about greenlighting original action concepts without an existing brand attached, favoring established properties, remakes of older films, and continuations of successful franchises. The Mechanic series itself is a perfect microcosm of that trend, an obscure 70s thriller reimagined for a new generation, then extended into a sequel once the reimagining proved successful enough to justify further investment. Critics who approached Mechanic Resurrection with skepticism about this broader industry trend sometimes folded that skepticism into their assessment of the film itself, treating it as another symptom of a risk-averse industry rather than judging it purely on its own merits. That's a fair critical lens to apply, even if it means the film sometimes gets judged as much for what it represents about the industry as for what it actually accomplishes on screen. Something that deserves closer attention is how the film handles pacing across its full runtime, which sits just under 100 minutes. That relatively lean runtime is worth praising in an era when action blockbusters frequently stretch past 2 hours, sometimes well past 2.5. Mechanic Resurrection moves through its 3 assassination set pieces at a steady clip, rarely lingering too long on exposition or subplot. This lean structure means the film rarely drags, even during its quieter character moments, because the filmmakers seem aware that audiences came primarily for the elaborate action sequences rather than extended dialogue scenes. At the same time, this same efficiency contributes to some of the character thinness discussed earlier. There simply isn't much runtime dedicated to deepening relationships or exploring motivations beyond what's strictly necessary to move the plot forward. It's a trade-off, tighter pacing in exchange for shallower characterization, and reasonable viewers can disagree about whether that trade-off was worth making. The editing throughout supports this brisk pacing, cutting quickly between planning sequences and their execution without excessive repetition. This editing choice ties back into the heist movie DNA discussed earlier in this analysis. Just as classic heist films often use quick cuts to show a plan taking shape before revealing how it unfolds in practice, Mechanic Resurrection frequently cuts away from Bishop's preparation only to reveal the full scope of his engineering once the assassination sequence begins. This creates small moments of surprise, even within an otherwise predictable structure, since audiences know a plan is coming together but don't always know exactly how each piece will click into place until the moment it happens on screen. Let's talk more specifically about the social media response the film generated, since that's part of what made it such a notable release beyond its box office numbers. Clips of the Sydney pool sequence spread widely, often shared purely as a visual spectacle disconnected from any broader discussion of the film's plot or quality. This kind of viral, single-scene attention is increasingly common for modern action films, where a single striking image or stunt can generate more online conversation than the film's overall critical reception. Social media users also frequently highlighted Tommy Lee Jones's brief appearance, often expressing amused appreciation for his laid-back, almost bemused performance in the middle of an otherwise tense thriller. This kind of internet reaction, celebrating a supporting performance's specific eccentricities rather than engaging deeply with the film's themes, has become a familiar pattern for mid-budget action movies that don't necessarily inspire deep analytical discussion but do produce memorable, shareable moments. It's worth examining the film's handling of its international settings a bit more critically. Since the use of exotic, glamorous locations is such a defining feature of its identity, there's a long tradition in action and spy cinema of using international locations, primarily as visual backdrops rather than meaningfully engaging with the cultures or communities being depicted. Mechanic, Resurrection largely follows that tradition. Rio, Thailand, Sydney, and other locations function mostly as scenic playgrounds for Bishop's exploits rather than settings with any real cultural specificity woven into the story. This is a common criticism leveled at globe-trotting action franchises generally, from James Bond films to the Mission Impossible series. And Mechanic, Resurrection doesn't do much to distinguish itself from that broader pattern. The locations are beautiful, they're varied, and they give the cinematography plenty to work with. But they remain largely decorative rather than integral to the story being told. Looking at Bishop as a character across both films, there's an interesting tension in how the franchise handles his moral position. He's presented as someone trying to leave violence behind, someone who wants a quiet, ordinary life. And yet the plot mechanics of both films require him to return to exactly the skill set he's trying to escape. This is, admittedly, a fairly standard action movie trope, the retired killer pulled back in for one last job, echoed across countless films in this genre. What Mechanic Resurrection does with this trope is competent but not especially innovative. It doesn't interrogate Bishop's psychology in any particularly deep way, doesn't spend much time exploring guilt, trauma, or moral conflict beyond surface-level gestures. Bishop accepts his forced return to violence, with relatively little internal struggle shown on screen, which keeps the pacing tight, but sacrifices some potential emotional complexity that a more character-driven version of this story might have explored. There's also an interesting structural choice worth noting in how the film frames its stakes. Rather than threatening a city, a government, or some abstract large-scale catastrophe, the entire plot hinges on the safety of a single person, Gina. This keeps the stakes personal and comprehensible throughout, avoiding some of the more bloated, world-ending plotting that plagues many modern action blockbusters. There's something almost refreshing about an action thriller where the entire engine of the plot is to save this one person I care about, rather than elaborate conspiracies involving nuclear devices or global terrorist networks. At the same time, this narrower scope means the film's tension relies heavily on audiences caring about Gina and her relationship with Bishop. And given how limited her characterization is throughout the film, that emotional investment doesn't always land as strongly as the filmmakers likely intended. Another angle worth exploring is how Mechanic Resurrection fits within Jason Statham's broader career trajectory around this specific period. By 2016, Statham had already become a recognizable face within the Fast and Furious franchise through his villainous turn in Furious 7, released the year before. That franchise's massive global success likely boosted interest in Statham's other action projects, including this sequel, giving Mechanic Resurrection a commercial tailwind it might not have had if released a few years earlier or later in his career. This context matters because it partly explains the film's box office resilience despite mixed reviews. Statham's star power alone was strong enough, by this point, to draw international audiences regardless of critical consensus, particularly in markets where his brand of physical, no-nonsense action cinema had built a loyal following over more than a decade. It's also worth discussing what this film reveals about the state of the mid-budget action thriller more broadly during the mid-2010s. This was a period when the genre was increasingly squeezed between two forces. Massive superhero blockbusters dominating box office charts on one end, and prestige, awards-focused dramas dominating critical conversation on the other. Films like Mechanic, Resurrection occupied a shrinking middle ground, relying on established stars, moderate budgets, and reliable genre formulas to justify their existence rather than trying to compete directly with either franchise-scale spectacle or award-season prestige. The fact that this film still found international commercial success suggests that audience appetite for this kind of mid-budget action thriller hadn't disappeared entirely, even as the industry's overall investment in these kinds of films began shrinking in subsequent years. Let's revisit the assassination sequences one more time, this time focusing specifically on how each one escalates in scale and complexity compared to the last. Since that escalation is a key structural device the film relies on to maintain audience engagement across its three-mission format. The prison sequence in Thailand is comparatively grounded, relying on close-quarters improvisation within a contained environment. The Sydney penthouse sequence expands the scale significantly, introducing vertical danger and architectural spectacle that the prison sequence didn't have room for. The yacht sequence in the final act combines elements of both earlier sequences, mixing tighter physical combat with a larger, more explosive setting on open water. This escalating structure mirrors a common formula in action filmmaking generally, where each successive set piece needs to top what came before it in scale or intensity to maintain a sense of rising stakes, even when the underlying plot mechanics remain fairly repetitive. One element that deserves specific praise is the practical stunt work underpinning these sequences. Statham has long been known for performing a significant amount of his own stunts, and this commitment to grounded, physically plausible action helps the film feel more visceral than movies that rely heavily on obvious digital effects for their action sequences. Even when the overall plot logic stretches credibility, the physical performances during fights and stunts maintain a sense of tangible danger that keeps the action grounded, even as the surrounding story becomes increasingly far-fetched. This is a meaningful distinction worth making in any discussion of modern action cinema, since audiences have grown increasingly sensitive to action sequences that feel weightless due to excessive digital effects work. Mechanic, Resurrection largely avoids that pitfall, giving its fights and stunts a tactile, grounded quality that helps sell even its most outlandish scenarios. Turning to dialogue and screenwriting more broadly, the script, credited to Philip Shelby and Tony Mosier, favors economy over wit. Characters generally speak in short, functional exchanges designed to move the plot forward rather than to reveal deep psychological complexity or memorable one-liners. This is a deliberate stylistic choice consistent with Statham's broader filmography, where his characters typically communicate more through action and physical presence than through extended dialogue. Some viewers find this minimalist approach refreshing, appreciating a genre film that doesn't overreach with unnecessary exposition or forced humor. Others find the dialogue thin and forgettable, wishing the script gave its characters, particularly the supporting cast, more room to develop distinct voices beyond their basic narrative function. Considering the film's thematic ambitions more broadly, Mechanic, Resurrection doesn't reach particularly far beyond its core premise of a man forced back into violence to protect someone he loves. There isn't much exploration of broader themes around justice, morality, or the ethics of vigilante violence that some action franchises attempt to layer into their premise. This isn't necessarily a flaw, since not every action film needs to carry heavy thematic weight to be effective entertainment. But it does mean the film offers relatively little for viewers looking for deeper meaning beneath its surface-level spectacle. It exists primarily as a vehicle for stunt work, exotic locations, and star power, and it doesn't pretend to be more than that. Let's also address how the film handles its female characters more broadly, since this touches on a common critique of the action genre as a whole during this era. Beyond Gina, the film's other significant female character is Michelle Yeoh's Dr. Figure, whose role, as discussed earlier, remains fairly limited despite the actress's considerable talent and history in action cinema. This pattern, where films assemble impressive casts of talented performers but then underutilize the women among them relative to their male co-stars, was a frequent point of criticism across the broader action genre during this period. Mechanic, Resurrection doesn't stand out as uniquely problematic in this regard compared to its genre peers, but it also doesn't do anything particularly progressive to buck that broader trend either. Examining the film's villain motivation a bit further, Crane's plan hinges on forcing Bishop into a position where his own skills become the instrument of his suffering, which is a reasonably clever thematic idea, even if its execution feels somewhat underdeveloped. The concept of forcing a reformed killer to use his talents against his will, turning his own competence into a weapon used against people he's forced to target, has real dramatic potential. Unfortunately, the film doesn't spend enough time exploring the psychological toll this forced return to violence takes on Bishop, largely because the brisk pacing prioritizes moving quickly from one action sequence to the next rather than lingering on emotional consequence. A version of this story with a slightly longer runtime, or a script willing to slow down occasionally, might have mined significantly more dramatic tension from this premise than the theatrical cut manages to deliver. It's also useful to compare Mechanic, Resurrection against other 2016 action releases too. Understand where it fit within that specific, competitive landscape. This was a year that saw major franchise entries across multiple genres, and mid-budget action thrillers like this one had to find audiences amid a crowded release calendar. Mechanic, Resurrection carved out its space by leaning heavily on Statham's established fan base and by marketing itself around specific, shareable visual moments like the Sydney Pool sequence, rather than trying to compete directly with bigger franchise tentpoles on marketing spend or scale. This kind of targeted, star-driven marketing approach reflects a broader strategy mid-budget action films increasingly relied on during this period, focusing on a reliable core audience rather than trying to capture the widest possible viewership. Let's spend some time discussing what specifically makes this film satisfying for its target audience, since understanding a film's appeal to its actual fans is just as important critically as cataloging its flaws. For fans of Statham's specific brand of action cinema, Mechanic, Resurrection delivers exactly the kind of controlled, physically grounded spectacle they came for. It doesn't ask audiences to sit through excessive melodrama or lengthy subplot detours before delivering its action. It moves briskly, it looks visually impressive throughout, and it gives Statham ample opportunity to demonstrate the specific blend of physical competence and dry composure that has defined his screen persona for over a decade. For audiences who simply want an efficient, visually engaging action thriller without heavy emotional investment, this film delivers reliably on that specific promise. At the same time, it's worth being honest about the film's limitations as a piece of storytelling beyond pure spectacle. The character work remains thin across the board. The villain lacks real menace or memorability. The romantic relationship at the story's center doesn't receive enough development to carry the emotional weight the plot assigns to it, and the overall plot mechanics rely on a level of geographic and logistical compression that some viewers will find distracting. These aren't minor nitpicks. They're structural weaknesses that prevent the film from rising above solid, competent genre entertainment into something more distinctive or memorable within the broader landscape of action cinema. Bringing this analysis toward its conclusion, Mechanic, Resurrection represents a fairly clear case study in what mid-budget action cinema looked like during the mid-2010s, reliably entertaining for its target audience. Visually impressive thanks to genuine international locations and practical stunt work, anchored by a reliable star performance from Jason Statham, but limited by thin characterization, a forgettable villain, and a plot that prioritizes efficient spectacle over deeper storytelling ambition. It succeeded commercially, particularly in international markets, and it generated genuine social media buzz around specific standout sequences, especially the Sydney penthouse pool assassination, even as professional critics remained largely divided or lukewarm on its overall quality. Ultimately, whether Mechanic, Resurrection succeeds as a film depends heavily on what a given viewer wants from it. Approached as a serious character drama or a tightly plotted thriller demanding careful internal logic, it comes up short in multiple areas. Approached as a globe-trotting engineering puzzle wrapped in an action movie's clothing, delivering striking visuals, competent stunt work, and a reliably charismatic lead performance, it delivers exactly what it promises without significant surprises in either direction. That gap between critical skepticism and audience enjoyment tells its own story about how differently professional criticism and general audience taste can evaluate the same piece of entertainment. And Mechanic, Resurrection remains a useful example of a film that thrived commercially by embracing its identity as pure, polished, internationally minded action entertainment rather than reaching for something more ambitious that it may not have been built to achieve. Whether or not it ranks among the best action films of its decade, it accomplished something many mid-budget sequels failed to do. It found and satisfied its specific audience, kept a long-running franchise commercially viable, and produced at least one sequence. That Sydney pool assassination, striking enough to be remembered long after the rest of the plot fades from memory. Looking back at this film years later, it's interesting to consider its place in the broader evolution of the action genre that followed it. In the years after Mechanic, Resurrection's release, action cinema shifted increasingly toward a small number of dominant approaches: the hyper-stylized, meticulously choreographed combat popularized by the John Wick series, the increasingly digital, franchise-connected spectacle of superhero cinema, and a continued reliance on legacy franchises like Fast and Furious to anchor major studio action releases. Mid-budget, star-driven thrillers in the specific mold of Mechanic, Resurrection became somewhat rarer as the decade progressed, as studios increasingly consolidated their action output around either massive franchise tentpoles or smaller streaming-focused productions rather than theatrical mid-budget releases. Viewed through that lens, Mechanic, Resurrection stands as something of a late example of a particular kind of action filmmaking: star-centered, internationally minded, moderately budgeted. That was already becoming less common in major theatrical release calendars by the time it arrived. It's also worth reflecting on whether the film's specific strengths, namely its striking use of real locations and its commitment to practical stunt work over digital spectacle, offer any lessons for action filmmaking going forward. As digital effects have become cheaper and more sophisticated, there's been an ongoing tension within the genre between films that lean heavily into computer-generated spectacle and films that continue prioritizing practical, physically grounded stunt work. Mechanic, Resurrection falls firmly into the latter camp, and its specific sequences, particularly the pool assassination and the prison escape, demonstrate how physically grounded, location-specific action can generate genuine visual interest without needing to rely on massive digital set pieces. This approach carries an inherent authenticity that purely digital spectacle often struggles to replicate. giving even a critically mixed film like this one a lasting visual identity that continues to circulate in online clips and discussions well after its theatrical release. In terms of franchise potential, Mechanic: Resurrection's ending leaves enough narrative room for further sequels, following the well-worn action franchise tradition of resolving the immediate threat while leaving the door open for future installments. Whether or not a third film in this specific series ever materializes, the underlying commercial logic behind such continuations remains straightforward. As long as a lead actor's star power and a franchise's specific brand of action spectacle continue drawing sufficient audiences internationally, particularly in markets outside North America, there remains a commercial incentive to continue extending the story, even without significant critical enthusiasm driving that continuation. This is simply how a large portion of the modern action genre sustains itself financially, prioritizing reliable audience turnout over universal critical acclaim. Stepping back from the specifics of plot, character, and technical execution, there's a broader question worth asking about films like Mechanic: Resurrection. What role do they serve within the overall ecosystem of modern cinema? Not every film needs to aim for profound thematic depth or innovative storytelling to justify its existence. Some films exist primarily to deliver reliable, well-executed entertainment within a familiar genre framework, giving audiences exactly the kind of experience they're expecting when they choose to watch it. Mechanic: Resurrection fulfills that specific role competently. It delivers globe-trotting spectacle, physically grounded action, a reliable star performance, and at least one genuinely memorable set piece, all within a tight, efficient runtime that respects audience time, even if it doesn't always respect narrative depth. For viewers who approach the film with those specific, modest expectations, it delivers a satisfying, if unremarkable, action experience. For viewers hoping for something more ambitious, more emotionally resonant, or more narratively innovative, the film's limitations become considerably more apparent. Before moving further into the film's individual set pieces, it's worth spending a moment on the production side of things, since the logistics behind making a globe-trotting action film like this are almost as interesting as the finished product itself. Rather than actually shooting in every location the story visits, productions like this frequently rely on substitute locations chosen for practical, budgetary, or logistical reasons rather than strict geographic accuracy. Bulgaria, for instance, has long served as a cost-effective filming hub for international productions looking to double for other parts of the world, offering studio infrastructure and skilled crews at a fraction of the cost of shooting in more expensive filming markets. Malaysia and Thailand similarly offered production incentives and visually striking locations that could stand in for the broader Southeast Asian setting the story required. Understanding this behind-the-scenes reality doesn't diminish the visual impact of the finished film, but it does add an interesting layer to any critical discussion of authenticity in globe-trotting action cinema. Audiences are rarely watching the exact geography the story claims to depict. They're watching a carefully assembled illusion of global scope, stitched together from whichever locations offered the best combination of visual appeal and production feasibility. This raises a broader point about how much authenticity actually matters to audiences enjoying this kind of film. For most viewers, the emotional and visual impact of seeing Bishop navigate a stunning penthouse pool or a heavily guarded prison complex doesn't depend on whether those specific frames were shot in the exact country the story claims. What matters is whether the illusion holds together convincingly enough to maintain immersion. And on that front, Mechanic: Resurrection largely succeeds. The cinematography and production design work together carefully to maintain visual consistency within each sequence, ensuring that even if a location wasn't shot exactly where the plot claims, it still feels geographically coherent and visually distinct from the other settings the story passes through. It's also worth considering the film within the specific context of Jason Statham's release schedule around this period. Since actors working at this pace often see their films blend together somewhat in the public's memory. In the years surrounding Mechanic, Resurrection's release, Statham also appeared in other action vehicles built around similar core appeals: physical competence, dry composure under pressure, and a preference for practical stunt work over digital spectacle. Some of these other projects lean more heavily into vehicular action, others into more straightforward hand-to-hand combat. But nearly all of them relied on the same fundamental promise that defines Mechanic, Resurrection, namely that audiences could trust Statham to deliver convincing, grounded action regardless of the specific plot surrounding him. This consistency has become something of a brand unto itself, arguably more reliable to audiences than any single franchise's specific continuity or quality. Viewers who enjoy one Statham vehicle can reasonably expect a similar baseline experience from another, even if the specific plot, villains, and settings differ considerably from film to film. This brand consistency also explains part of why critical reviews for films like this tend to matter less to overall box office performance than they might for other kinds of movies. When audiences already know roughly what they're going to get from a given star's latest release, critical consensus becomes less of a deciding factor in their choice to watch it. This is similar to how audiences approach certain long-running franchises or specific genre veterans across other parts of the industry. The specific, critical reception of any individual installment matters less than the audience's accumulated trust in the overall brand, built up across a performer's career. Mechanic, Resurrection benefited directly from this dynamic, drawing audiences who trusted Statham's specific brand of action filmmaking regardless of what critics ultimately said about this particular installment. Let's also take a moment to consider Sam Hazeldine's performance and career context a bit further, since his role as the film's primary villain deserves a slightly more generous look than the earlier critique suggested. Hazeldine brings a controlled, understated menace to Crane rather than leaning into more theatrical villain conventions, which is a reasonable creative choice, even if it results in a less immediately memorable screen presence. There's an argument to be made that a quieter, more calculating villain fits the film's overall tone better than a more theatrical, scenery-chewing performance would have. The issue isn't necessarily that Hazeldine's performance is poorly executed. It's that the script surrounding him doesn't give the character enough distinct personality traits or memorable dialogue to elevate his understated approach into something audiences will remember years later. A skilled, restrained performance still needs strong material to become truly memorable, and Crane simply isn't written with enough specificity to fully capitalize on what Hazeldine brings to the role. Similarly, it's worth revisiting Jessica Alba's career context around this release. By 2016, Alba had spent over a decade balancing acting work with a growing business career, and her screen appearances had become somewhat less frequent compared to earlier points in her career. Her casting in Mechanic, Resurrection reflects a fairly common industry pattern where recognizable stars return periodically to genre filmmaking, bringing built-in audience familiarity to supporting or co-lead roles without necessarily requiring extensive promotional groundwork to reintroduce them to audiences. Alba brings genuine warmth and screen presence to her scenes despite the character's structural limitations discussed earlier, and it's easy to imagine a version of this film that gave her considerably more to do, particularly during the back half of the story once she's actually kidnapped and largely sidelined from the main action. Expanding further on the film's marketing and promotional campaign, much of the promotional material for Mechanic, Resurrection focused heavily on the film's most visually striking sequences. particularly the Sydney Pool assassination, using it prominently in trailers and promotional stills well before the film's actual release. This kind of marketing strategy, leading with a film's single most spectacular set piece rather than trying to sell audiences on its overall plot or character depth, is a common approach for action films that know their core appeal rests more on specific moments of visual spectacle than on cohesive storytelling. It's a reasonably honest marketing approach in that sense. The film essentially promised audiences a handful of genuinely inventive action sequences wrapped around a serviceable plot. And it largely delivered on that specific promise, without significant discrepancy between what the marketing implied and what audiences actually received. It's also worth touching on award season considerations, or rather the near-total absence of them, since this helps illustrate exactly where a film like Mechanic Resurrection sits within the broader hierarchy of the film industry's own self-assessment. Films built primarily around stunt work and international spectacle rarely receive significant recognition from major awards bodies, which tend to prioritize screenplay craft, dramatic performance, and directorial vision over pure physical filmmaking achievement. This isn't necessarily a fair reflection of the skill and precision required to design and execute complex stunt sequences, but it does reflect a long-standing bias within awards culture that consistently undervalues stunt coordination and practical action filmmaking compared to more traditionally dramatic achievements. Mechanic Resurrection, unsurprisingly, generated no significant awards attention, which is consistent with how the broader industry has historically treated films built around this specific set of strengths. Let's dig a little deeper into the film's opening stretch in Rio, because the way a film establishes its heroes' ordinary life before disrupting it says a lot about what kind of story it wants to tell. Bishop teaching sailing lessons, living quietly, allowing himself something resembling happiness with Gina, is a deliberate contrast to the version of him audiences met in the first film. A man defined almost entirely by discipline, isolation, and controlled violence. Giving him warmth and a functioning relationship before ripping it away is a classic action movie strategy, designed to maximize emotional stakes once the plot machinery kicks into gear. The problem is that this stretch of the film moves quickly, spending only a limited amount of time establishing that relationship before the kidnapping occurs. Compare this to films that spend a full act carefully building a relationship before threatening it. And the emotional foundation here feels comparatively rushed. Audiences are asked to accept Bishop's devotion to Gina largely on faith, trusting the actors' chemistry to fill in gaps the script doesn't have time to develop. Statham and Alba do have believable chemistry on screen, which helps carry this shorthand further than the script alone would manage. But it remains a shorthand rather than a fully earned emotional foundation. It's also worth taking a closer, more technical look at how the Sydney sequence achieves its specific visual impact. Since so much of the film's cultural footprint rests on this single set piece, the sequence relies on verticality as its primary source of tension, placing danger not in the number of enemies Bishop faces, but in the sheer height and precariousness of the location itself. An infinity pool suspended above a cityscape is inherently unsettling to look at, tapping into a common human unease around heights and unstable structures. By building the entire confrontation around this architectural anxiety rather than a conventional shootout, the filmmakers found a way to generate visceral tension without relying purely on weapons or hand-to-hand combat. This is smart, efficient filmmaking from a pure craft perspective, using environment as antagonist in a way that elevates an otherwise standard assassination mission into something visually singular. It's a reminder that action sequences don't need larger scale or more explosions to be memorable. Sometimes a single striking location, used cleverly, can outshine a much bigger, noisier set piece elsewhere in the same film. Contrast that with the Thailand prison sequence, which relies on a completely different set of tools to generate tension. Rather than architectural vertigo, this sequence leans on claustrophobia and the constant threat of discovery. Bishop has to navigate a heavily guarded, contained environment where a single mistake could expose his presence and end the mission in failure. This kind of tension, built around stealth and the threat of exposure rather than open combat, connects the film to a long lineage of prison break and infiltration thrillers. The sequence works reasonably well within that tradition, though it doesn't necessarily bring anything groundbreaking to a subgenre that has been explored extensively across decades of cinema. From classic prison escape dramas to modern spy thrillers built around similar infiltration scenarios. The film's final act, centered on the yacht and the arms dealer target, arguably carries the heaviest burden structurally, since it needs to resolve both the assassination plot and Bishop's confrontation with Crane simultaneously. This kind of dual climax, wrapping up the mission of the week structure while also delivering the larger emotional confrontation between hero and villain, is common in franchise action filmmaking. But it's also difficult to execute cleanly within a limited runtime. Mechanic. Resurrection handles this by compressing both confrontations into a fairly tight sequence of events, which keeps the pacing brisk, but occasionally makes the resolution feel slightly rushed compared to the more deliberately paced build-up earlier in the film. Some viewers found this efficient and satisfying, appreciating a climax that didn't overstay its welcome. Others felt that Crane, as a villain, deserved a more drawn-out final confrontation given how much narrative weight his revenge plot carried throughout the story. Let's also consider how the film handles the audience's relationship with Bishop's moral code specifically. Across both films in this rebooted series, Bishop operates by a specific, almost professional set of ethics. He kills only when necessary. He takes no pleasure in violence, and he values precision and cleanliness over brutality for its own sake. This characterization connects him to a long tradition of cinematic hitmen defined by internal codes of honor, stretching from classic noir assassins through more modern archetypes across the action and thriller genres. Resurrection maintains this characterization consistently, never allowing Bishop to become genuinely sadistic or reckless even under extreme duress. This consistency is one of the more subtly effective aspects of Statham's performance across both films. He plays Bishop with the same measured control whether he's teaching sailing lessons or dismantling an elaborate assassination plot, which gives the character a believable through line even when the plot around him becomes increasingly far-fetched. It's worth spending some time on the film's approach to sound design and how it complements the visual spectacle discussed earlier. Action sequences in Mechanic. Resurrection rely heavily on environmental sound. Water, structural creaks, mechanical clicks, to build tension during the planning and execution of each assassination. This is a smart choice given how much of the film's appeal rests on watching elaborate plans unfold rather than simply reacting to gunfire and explosions. By emphasizing the specific sounds of machinery, water pressure, and structural stress, the sound design reinforces the engineering puzzle feel of each set piece, making the audience acutely aware of the physical mechanics at play even before a plan fully reveals itself on screen. This kind of detailed environmental sound work is often overlooked in broader discussions of action filmmaking, but it plays a meaningful role in why sequences like the Sydney Pool assassination feel as tense and immersive as they do, even without extensive dialogue explaining what's happening. Turning back to the franchise's history for a moment, it's worth remembering that the original 1972 film starring Charles Bronson was a much smaller, more austere thriller, stripped of the globe-trotting spectacle that defines the 2011 and 2016 versions. That original film focused tightly on the mentor-student relationship between two assassins, using a much more restrained visual and narrative style consistent with the grittier action cinema of that decade. The decision to expand this concept into an internationally minded spectacle franchise reflects broader shifts in what audiences expect from action cinema across the decades separating these versions. Modern audiences, accustomed to franchise filmmaking built around scale, international settings, and elaborate stunt sequences, likely would find the austere pacing of the original 1972 film jarring by comparison. This evolution says as much about changing audience expectations across nearly half a century of action cinema as it does about any specific creative choices made by the 2016 filmmakers. Considering how the film has aged in the years since its release, it's interesting to note how well certain elements have held up compared to others. The practical stunt work and location-based action sequences remain visually impressive regardless of when you watch the film, since they don't rely on digital effects technology that can look dated as rendering techniques improve over time. The thinner elements of the film, particularly its underdeveloped romantic subplot and its comparatively flat villain, feel more noticeably dated when measured against how the action genre has evolved since 2016, particularly with the continued rise of character-driven action storytelling popularized by franchises that emerged around the same period. Viewed today, Mechanic Resurrection functions almost as a time capsule of a specific mid-2010s approach to globe-trotting action cinema, one that valued visual spectacle and star power over the tighter character writing that later became more consistently expected across the genre. It's also worth considering the film's afterlife on streaming platforms and home video, since for many viewers, this is actually how they first encountered Mechanic Resurrection rather than in a theater. Mid-budget action thrillers like this one often find a second, sometimes even larger, audience through streaming and cable rebroadcasts, where viewers browsing for something undemanding and entertaining are more likely to give a film like this a chance than they might have been willing to pay full price for a theatrical ticket. This kind of extended streaming lifespan has become an increasingly important part of how films like this justify their continued cultural relevance years after their theatrical release window closes. Anecdotally, a significant portion of the ongoing online discussion around specific sequences, particularly the Sydney Pool assassination, appears to come from viewers discovering the film well after its initial release, discovering clips shared out of context on social media platforms, and then seeking out the full film or specific scenes afterward. Let's also briefly address how the film handles humor, since tone management is a genuinely tricky balancing act in action cinema. Mechanic Resurrection largely favors a serious, controlled tone throughout its runtime, reserving most of its lighter moments for Tommy Lee Jones's scenes, which stand out precisely because they contrast so sharply with the film's otherwise straight-faced approach. This is a reasonably effective tonal strategy, allowing the film to maintain tension during its action sequences while still giving audiences occasional relief through Jones's specific brand of world-weary humor. Some action franchises struggle by either leaning too heavily into constant quips that undercut tension, or by maintaining such unrelenting seriousness that the film becomes exhausting to watch. Mechanic Resurrection largely avoids both pitfalls by concentrating its humor into a specific, contained character rather than spreading it unevenly across the entire cast. Finally, before wrapping up, it's worth considering what this film might suggest about the future of similarly structured action franchises going forward. As streaming services increasingly finance and distribute mid-budget action films directly, bypassing traditional theatrical release strategies altogether. Films very similar in structure and ambition to Mechanic Resurrection have become more common though often with reduced marketing budgets and correspondingly less cultural visibility. The specific theatrical success this film achieved, driven by a combination of star power, international box office strength, and viral, shareable action sequences, represents a commercial model that has become somewhat harder to replicate as theatrical distribution for mid-budget genre films has continued to shrink. In that sense, Mechanic, Resurrection may end up representing something of a late, successful example of a theatrical action model that was already beginning to fade by the time of its release, making its box office performance and its lasting online cultural footprint even more notable in hindsight. One more angle worth exploring before wrapping up is how this film treats the idea of professional identity. Since Bishop's entire characterization is built around the notion of being extraordinarily good at a very specific, narrow skill set, he isn't portrayed as a broadly talented action hero capable of anything the plot requires. He's portrayed specifically as an engineer of death, someone whose genius lies in transforming ordinary environments into deadly traps through careful planning rather than raw physical dominance. This specific characterization connects Mechanic, Resurrection to a broader tradition of competence porn within genre fiction. Stories that derive much of their appeal from watching a skilled professional execute their specialized craft with precision and confidence. Just as heist films derive satisfaction from watching a crew of specialists each contribute their specific expertise toward a shared goal, Mechanic, Resurrection derives satisfaction from watching Bishop apply his singular expertise across a variety of different environments and challenges. This through line gives the film a consistent identity even as its individual sequences vary considerably in scale, tone, and setting. It's also worth thinking about how the film uses its title, and specifically the word resurrection, beyond its literal reference to Bishop surviving the ending of the first film. There's a broader thematic resonance to the idea of a supposedly finished chapter of someone's life being forcibly reopened against their will, which connects to a common anxiety explored across many stories about people trying to escape their past. The past rarely stays buried as neatly as we'd like, and the specific skills or reputations we spend years trying to leave behind have a way of resurfacing exactly when we least want them to. Mechanic, Resurrection doesn't explore this theme with tremendous depth or subtlety, but the basic emotional truth underlying it, the fear that your past will eventually catch up with you no matter how far you run or how thoroughly you try to disappear, gives the film's premise a small kernel of relatable emotional weight beneath its surface-level action spectacle. Considering the film's runtime allocation one final time, it becomes clear just how tightly the screenplay had to balance its various competing demands. Establishing Bishop's new life, introducing the threat against Gina, and then delivering 3 distinct, elaborately staged assassination sequences, all within well under 2 hours. This is an ambitious structural challenge, and it's worth acknowledging that the filmmakers largely succeeded in delivering all 3 major set pieces without the film ever feeling bloated or overstuffed. The trade-off, as discussed at length throughout this analysis, is that character depth and thematic exploration inevitably suffered in service of maintaining that brisk, set-piece-focused pacing. Whether that trade-off represents the right, creative choice depends heavily on what you personally want out of an action thriller. But it's hard to deny that the film accomplishes its core structural goal efficiently, delivering exactly the number and scale of major action sequences that its marketing promised without excessive padding in between. Finally, it's worth acknowledging the specific cultural moment this film arrived within. An era when international co-productions blending Hollywood stars with production financing and filming infrastructure from multiple countries had become an increasingly standard model for mid-budget action filmmaking. Mechanic, Resurrection. Produced through a combination of American and European financing with production support spanning multiple Southeast Asian and European filming locations, exemplifies exactly this kind of internationally assembled production model. This approach allows films to access diverse tax incentives, production infrastructure, and visually distinct locations across multiple countries while still anchoring the production around a recognizable English-language star capable of driving both English-speaking and international box office simultaneously. This model has become increasingly central to how mid-budget action cinema sustains itself financially in a global marketplace, increasingly dominated by franchise tentpoles on one end and streaming-financed content on the other. Iconic. Resurrection stands as a fairly representative example of how that model functioned during the mid-2010s. In closing this analysis, Mechanic, Resurrection remains a fascinating case study, precisely because of how clearly it illustrates the gap between critical and popular reception in modern action cinema. It's a film that critics largely found forgettable, yet audiences worldwide turned into a genuine commercial success and a recurring subject of online discussion, largely on the strength of its visual spectacle and its star's reliable screen presence. Whether that makes it a good film depends entirely on which criteria you value most when evaluating entertainment. As a piece of pure escapist action cinema, delivering exotic locations, inventive assassination set pieces, and a dependable lead performance from one of the genre's most consistent stars, it succeeds. As a piece of storytelling with lasting emotional or thematic resonance, it falls considerably shorter. That tension between spectacle and substance, between what critics want and what mainstream audiences actually respond to, is exactly what makes Mechanic, Resurrection worth revisiting and discussing years after its theatrical release, even for viewers who might not consider it among the very best the action genre has to offer. And that, ultimately, is the most honest way to sum up this film. Not a masterpiece, not a disaster, but a well-crafted piece of globe-trotting entertainment that knew exactly what kind of movie it wanted to be, and largely succeeded on those specific terms, even while leaving plenty of room on the table for a version of this story with a bit more depth and a bit more courage in its characterization. If there's one final takeaway worth carrying away from this whole discussion, it's that action cinema doesn't have to choose between being taken seriously and being genuinely satisfying to watch. Mechanic, Resurrection never pretends to be anything more than confident, well-produced genre entertainment, and there's real value in a film knowing its own identity that clearly it doesn't chase prestige it was never going to earn, and it doesn't apologize for prioritizing spectacle over depth. Instead, it commits fully to what it does well: inventive, physically grounded set pieces, striking use of real locations, and a lead performance that never wavers in its confidence and control. Those strengths are real, even if they exist alongside genuine, well-documented weaknesses in character writing and villain construction. Judging a film honestly means holding both of those truths at once, appreciating what it accomplishes while being clear-eyed about where it falls short, rather than either dismissing it entirely or overpraising it beyond what it actually delivers. Mechanic, Resurrection sits comfortably in that middle space. A film worth watching for exactly what it is, and worth discussing precisely because of the interesting tension between its genuine craftsmanship and its equally genuine shortcomings.